Hello, all, and welcome to the 2020 Champions of Literacy. We're so glad and honored that you chose to join us this year, even if this annual celebration is looking very different than in years past. While we wish we were together this evening, listening to music and enjoying food, we're happy that we can all enjoy a great evening talking about books and our favorite city, and do so from the comfort and safety of our homes. My name is Michael Brix, and I am the Executive Director of Treehouse Books. I'm also serving as the host tonight. I'm trying to do my best impersonation of Marty Moscoane and Terry Gross, two of my heroes. Before we begin, just a few tech notes. You should feel encouraged to engage on the YouTube live chat stream. Go ahead right now. Just say hello, maybe put in what neighborhood you're from, where you live. We're going to be talking a lot about Philadelphia tonight, and there's going to be opportunities for you to ask the authors your questions as well. So feel free to utilize that live chat whenever you'd like. Nicole, our wonderful tech operator, is going to monitor the chat and pass along your questions to us here. Of course, like we've all experienced by now, I'm sure, with any streaming event, there is the chance of technical difficulties or interruptions. And if anything happens, just hang tight. We'll quickly resolve them and move on, all right? I also want to invite you to stay on after the author talks and have a glass of champagne or cider or juice. And I want you to have those ready because we're going to celebrate and toast to 15 amazing years of Treehouse Books in our North Philadelphia neighborhood, raising a community of readers, writers, and thinkers. We're going to begin tonight by introducing our authors, and I'll ask them to come on screen with me here as I talk about them. Liz Moore is a writer of fiction and creative nonfiction. After she received her MFA from Hunter College, she moved to Philadelphia for UPenn's acclaimed Arts Edge residency. She's the winner of the Medici Book Club Prize, Philly's Athenaeum Literacy Award, and the Rome Prize in Literature. Her novels have been touted as fiercely intelligent, ethereal, and elegant and beautifully constructed. Long Bright River is set in Philadelphia, with much of the action taking place in Kensington. Liz lives with her family in Philadelphia and is a faculty member of the MFA program in creative writing at Temple University. Welcome, Liz. Glad you're here.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here. Should I now introduce the book and read briefly from it, or are we?
Let me introduce Asali first, and we'll get you both on the same page, and then we'll have you do that. Perfect.
Thanks for having me. Really happy.
Yeah, no, we're glad that you're here. Absolutely, thank you. Asali Solomon is our other author here tonight. She is a writer of short fiction and novels. She holds a PhD in English from UC Berkeley and an MFA in fiction from the University of Iowa. Her first book is a collection of short stories called Get Down. She is also published in anthologies and literature reviews. Her short piece, Cold Water for Bloodstains, was commissioned by the pianist Jason Moran for a piece combining text and music. Disgruntled was her first novel and is set in and around Philadelphia. Asali is associate professor and chair of English and the director of creative writing at Haverford College. Welcome, Asali. You're muted up there, Asali. Go ahead and unmute.
Hi, thanks for having me and welcome everyone.
We're so glad to have both of you here. Yeah, we're gonna do what you said, Liz. We're gonna take a couple minutes and just have the two of you share a little bit about yourself. Maybe fill in what needs to be said that I didn't say in those intros. And tell the audience that's tuned in tonight a little bit about your books. I think a lot of them have read the books already, but for those who haven't, if you could just take a couple minutes to just describe the storyline and then read a passage or two from your book. All right, so we're gonna start with Liz and then we'll go over to Asali. I will mute in order to let that happen seamlessly. Go ahead, Liz.
Sure. So Long Bright River is the story of two sisters. It takes place primarily in the neighborhood of Kensington here in Philadelphia. The older sister, Mickey, is a member of the Philadelphia Police Department, and the younger sister, Casey, is suffering from addiction as the novel begins. Within the first couple of chapters, Casey goes missing at the same time that a series of murders is beginning in the neighborhood of women who fit her demographic. And Mickey takes it upon herself to go searching for her younger sister, despite the fact that they are long estranged at the start of the novel. So I'm going to read very briefly about a page of text. This is in Mickey's voice, describing her somewhat strange relationship with her sister. Officially, Casey and I no longer speak to one another. We haven't for 5 years. There have been rare occasions since then, 3 to be precise, when I have been required to interact with her at work, in my capacity as an officer and in her capacity as a suspect. And during each of those times, I have conducted myself with dignity, as any professional would, either processing her or releasing her, as I would do for any offender. To her credit, she too has conducted herself respectfully. When it is necessary to do so, I gently place handcuffs on the wrists of my sister, and I tell her the particular offense for which she is being arrested, usually solicitation and possession of narcotics, one time with intent to sell. And then I narrate her rights to her, and then I place a gentle hand on the crown of her head to ensure that she doesn't obtain an injury as she enters the back seat of our vehicle. And then I quietly close the door, and then I drive her to the station, and then I book her, and then the 2 of us sit silently across from one another in the holding cell, not speaking, not even looking at one another. Truman, who is her former partner, who's out on medical leave at the start of the book, Truman was with me each time, and each time he too remained silent, watching the 2 of us guardedly, his eyes darting back and forth from me to Casey to me again, waiting to see what would happen. That was the weirdest thing I've ever seen, he said, as we were driving away after the first of these episodes. I shrugged and didn't reply. I suppose it would look weird to someone who doesn't understand the particulars of our history and the tacit agreement we've come to in recent years. I've never tried to explain it to Truman or anyone else. You look out for her, he said another time. When I demurred, he continued. You would have been done with patrol years ago if you weren't out here keeping an eye on your sister. You would have taken the detective exam. I told him that this was not, in fact, true. It's just that I've grown fond of the neighborhood and have grown to care a great deal about its well-being. And also, I find the history of the neighborhood interesting, and I like to watch it as it grows and changes. And lastly, it's never boring. On the contrary, it's exciting. Some people do have trouble with Kensington, but to me, the neighborhood itself has become like a relative, slightly problematic, but dear in the old-fashioned way that word is sometimes used, treasured, valuable to me. I am invested in it, in other words. And I'll stop there and eagerly await Asali's reading.
Thank you so much, Liz. That was fantastic. Asali, yeah, same thing. Just kind of share a little bit about Disgruntled and maybe read us something that'll help us know a little bit more about it.
So Disgruntled is the story of basically a very dramatic family explosion. There's a family, Kenya and her parents, John Brown and Sheila, who live in West Philadelphia. Her parents are Black nationalists, and they're part of a sort of politically active group. And then something happens and the family breaks up, and Kenya finds herself basically in exile with her mom on the main line, and other adventures ensue from there. So I'm just going to read basically from the first couple of pages. And so this is just kind of descriptive. In the first grade at Henry Charles Lee School in West Philadelphia, when Kenya told kids that she celebrated Kwanzaa, no one knew what she was talking about. By the third grade, led by the tiny tyrant Letitia Simmons, the kids were calling her an African booty scratcher and chanting to a conga line rhythm, "You don't get no presents, you don't get no presents." In fact, she did get presents on the last morning of Kwanzaa, 7 days after Christmas. By the fourth grade, Kenya was down to one friend. It wasn't just the Kwanzaa problem. And anyway, she could have lied about Kwanzaa, like she suspected Fatima McCullers did. Fatima, whose dad had dreadlocks and who always said Christmas and Santa Claus with a wavering inflection. It was also that Kenya couldn't eat any pork, including the bologna sandwiches that were the everyday fare of the lunchroom. something to do with her father muttering that white people forced slaves to eat hog guts. Though, as far as Kenya could see, white people loved bologna enough to give it both a first and second name. It was that she wasn't allowed to watch Gimme a Break, Good Times, or Different Strokes because, according to her mother, watching Black people on TV acting the fool was worse than not watching any at all. It was that Kenya was forbidden to actually speak the Pledge of Allegiance and had been directed to mouth it with her hand, not actually touching her chest. It was that she had to call her father Baba, and when she'd asked if she could call him Daddy like other people did, it had triggered what seemed like days of lectures, during which Kenya learned to hate the phrase other people. It was that while her parents said grace like normal people, they directed it to the Creator instead of God. It was that she was never, ever allowed to say the N word, even during the step where they had to say N word boy. In fact, when she had first heard someone say it in school, Letitia Simmons in the 3rd grade, Kenya said, "Ooh," expecting everyone to join in. They didn't. Even Aaliyah, the pale girl from Sudan, actual Africa, but no one called her a booty scratcher, with a long rope of hair, was laughing at her. And when Kenya pointed at Letitia explaining, she said the N word, they laughed even harder. So I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Asali. That line about baloney was the first line that I laughed out loud when I was reading this book, and it wasn't the last time. I think it like just really set the tone for Disgruntled, just in a way that was just like really special, and let me know what kind of what I was getting into. And I like that first and last name of baloney bit. Asali, you were born and raised in West Philadelphia, from what I read. In fact, I think in one interview you compared it to another person famously born and raised in West Philadelphia. But you studied and taught all over the country. So what was so special about Philadelphia that made you feel like you wanted to write about it?
So when I first started thinking about it, it was basically like what I was, the youth that I was trying to sort of work through. And I didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about it, like what was unique to it. But sort of as I, lived in different places, I thought about, Philadelphia has some really particular features, and certainly had some really particular features when I was younger. One of them is that I come from West Philadelphia, which has traditionally been a majority Black community, and also like really deep pockets of eccentricity here. Like, on the one hand, you might think about something like Move, but on the other hand, I just like knew vegetarians who, back then only drank room temperature spring water and ate things that, no regular people didn't eat until 20 years later, that kind of stuff, all different kinds of spiritual experiments and that kind of thing. And also just kind of like I have a line in another story that like Philadelphia was a very Black city that had a lot of very hateful white people in it. And like one of the things that was like really particular was like the geography of Philadelphia growing up, like the places where like, and I think it's a funny thing now because of a lot of the gentrification neighborhood changes, places where you go to a BYO were places that you absolutely as a Black person like would just not travel into, when I was young. And I think there were a lot of things about the city that I thought were the case with every city, but they really weren't. And so those are some of the things that like have kept me interested in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you're also raising a family in Philadelphia, in West Philadelphia, right? So
Yep.
how have things changed? How have things differed a little bit from when you were growing up?
So I grew up in West Philadelphia. We always sort of grew up. I wasn't really in what they were calling University City now, although I think the boundaries of what is called University City have crept up to where my parents live. It's so, where I live now, which is kind of by Baltimore Avenue, I think was a Black neighborhood. It was depressed in a lot of ways. A lot of people would say, like, so Clark Park, which is now like a really thriving concern, had been sort of abandoned. Same with a park, Malcolm X Park down the street from my parents. So I mean, the big story tends to be gentrification. I mean, the neighborhood is just like a lot more, it's a lot wealthier and a lot less Black than it used to be. But a sort of more interesting change I would say about the area I'm in right now is that it's a very queer neighborhood now, which was not the case when I was growing up, right? I mean, and so I think like West Philadelphia has really strong, and no, we have anarchists too. So there's a lot going on here that was not going on when I was younger.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. We're just getting like baseline Philadelphia, and then we're gonna connect it to stories. Liz, I'm gonna turn to you for a second and just talk a little bit about your Philadelphia experience. You came to Philadelphia to do the Arts Edge residency at UPenn, and then you decided to settle down here in Philadelphia. So what went into making that decision?
A few things. One, my then boyfriend, now spouse, comes from the suburbs of Philadelphia. So he grew up in the Lansdale, Northtown area. And his parents and one of his sisters was still living here. And so I had no personal connection to Philadelphia other than my husband's family. But and it was actually just a coincidence that I got the Arts Edge residency at Penn that year. But once I was here and began to see what an interesting city Philadelphia was, and see it as a place that I might like to live long term, Mac, my husband, was extremely enthusiastic about it, obviously, because it was nice also to be close to his family. And so we've been here a little over a decade now. We're raising our kids here. We live in South Philly, and have no plans to leave. It's really it's the place I've lived longest as an adult, for sure. I grew up in Massachusetts, but I left when I was 18 and never lived there again. So at this point, Philadelphia is for sure the city I know best. I never really knew Boston that well. And at this point, when I go back to New York, which is where I lived in between, I feel like it's a different city than I ever knew, because it changes so quickly.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it really feels like home.
I feel like I moved to the city right after high school and never left. So it's been wonderful. I want to get a little bit into Long Bright River, because you set Long Bright River in Kensington, in the heart of the opioid crisis, and that's obviously a decision that was intentional. What was the draw for Kensington? What made you set your novel there?
So one of the first experiences I had after I moved to Philadelphia in 2009 was I was invited by a friend of my sister-in-law, who was a photographer who was making work in the neighborhood. And he wanted a writer to go along with him to conduct interviews with some of the subjects of his portraits, sort of to get their oral histories, and at the same time that he was working. And we ended up very briefly collaborating. I would say I went up with him probably 6 times over the course of one summer in 2009, and we published a photo essay together about it with a small press called The Head and the Hand in Kensington, which some of you might know. That was the extent of my initial work there with the photographer. After that, I sort of kept going back to the neighborhood for other reasons. I found myself being drawn back over and over again. I think back in 2009, the neighborhood was not being covered by the media in the way that it is today. And in fact, opioid use as a whole was not being covered by the media in the way that it is today. So I couldn't have predicted what I would see there. And I found myself very moved by it, and moved by the stories of the people I was speaking with. I also have a personal connection to the material in that my own family has a long history of addiction. And so I think probably the emotional component of the material comes out of, partially out of autobiography. But I ended up returning to the neighborhood to do community work there. So I led free writing workshops at a Women's Day shelter, which is housed within St. Francis Inn. And that experience was also profoundly moving. And all of those things combined probably contributed to the initial inspiration for Long Bright River.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to do something. I read Maureen Corrigan, who, most Philly folks are going to connect to her reviews on Fresh Air, but she wrote this really beautiful thing about Long Bright River in the Washington Post. She says that she has all this great language, so I'm going to try to get it right. She says that it nervously twists, turns, and subverts readers' expectations till its very last pages. Simultaneously, it also manages to grow into something else, a sweeping, elegiac novel about a blighted city. As Chandler did for various sections of Los Angeles, Moore, who lives in Philadelphia, excavates Kensington and surrounding areas in Philadelphia, illuminating the rot, the shiny facades of gentrification, and the sturdy endurance of small pockets of community life. It's just really, really nice. The characters and Mickey specifically is so nuanced, but it also feels like as if Philadelphia and like Kensington specifically are as much characters in the novel itself. And so I just want to ask you about and Asali, we're going to come to you with a very similar question. So, get ready for this one, but what role does Kensington play? What role does the city play in Long Bright River?
I like Asali, I teach writing, and one of the things that I always say to my students about my own process for writing novels is that place almost comes to me first. I've written 4 novels. I'm working on my 5th. All of them are set in different places, and all of them I think of when I begin to write as all right, this is my Philly novel. This is my Boston novel. This is my Brooklyn novel, whatever. It's place comes first. And so when I began spending a lot of time in Kensington, I felt very creatively moved by it, and also approached it with the project with some trepidation, because Kensington is not a place that I have lived myself, and I'm an outsider to Kensington. I have no family history in Kensington. And so although I live in Philadelphia, Kensington in a lot of ways feels like a city unto itself, and a place unto itself. And so I think I had to be very careful with my research process in writing Long Bright River, because I think there's always the possibility of, I can't say misinterpretation because every interpretation is valid, but the interpretation that scared me the most and still scares me the most about this book is one that, for as grateful as I was for Maureen Corrigan's review, which was incredibly generous, when she uses the phrase blighted city, a portrait of a blighted city, it makes me cringe a little bit, because that's not how I think of Kensington, and it's not how I think of Philadelphia. And so it's a fine line to walk, between painting a portrait of a neighborhood that has been failed over and over again by policy and by corruption. In this case, it's difficult to discuss this book without spoiling it, but I'm talking specifically about police corruption and police abuse of power, which are big themes in this book, without it coming across as it's the city's fault or the neighborhood's fault. I don't think it is. I think Kensington is actually a pretty vibrant place with a history that predates this book by a couple hundred years. So that's my tense relationship with the portrayal of Kensington in the book, and one that was probably unavoidable, but I did it and it's done, and here we are.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, when I moved to Philadelphia in '98, I moved a block away from K&A. So I lived there for about 10 years. So, at that time, the drugs were slowly shifting from pure heroin. In fact, it was often called the purest heroin in the country, to this more synthetic stuff that's happening today. But, when I was reading when I was reading Long Bright River, I was like feeling familiar. I felt like it felt very alive and very correct. What things besides walking around and being in Kensington, what were some other ways that you researched, Kensington and brought it to life?
A lot of the research was pretty organic. I was just like spending time in the neighborhood and speaking with people who'd spent a lot of time in the neighborhood. The more formal research that I did was I spoke with a couple of physicians who specialized in addiction medicine. One, Charles O'Brien at Penn, who I think founded Penn's Center for Addiction Medicine, or at least was integral in the founding of it. And I also spoke with 4 police officers and did a ride along with one member of the PPD, who was a community relations officer who, although he was very kind, was certainly giving me like a very filtered version of police work, which I think both of us were aware of as we were doing the ride along. But that was very helpful to understanding what a police shift looks like from start to finish.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, as someone who lives in and loves Philly, I always find myself getting excited from both of your novels when I was like recognizing like places and streets. And, Asali, you wrote about the Richard Allen projects, and you mentioned the Church of the Advocate. Treehouse Books' story also has roots at the Church of the Advocate. So it's like just some of those things that, connect us. Asali, what for you, the question then goes back to you for Disgruntled, what were, in what ways did the city itself play a role in Disgruntled?
So, I mean, I think it's the case for both of these, Long Bright River and Disgruntled, that they couldn't have been written without the city. Like the city, the city is certainly a kind of character, and particularly a big part of Disgruntled is the disconnect between West Philadelphia and the main line. It's almost like they're different countries. And none of the interesting things in Disgruntled happened to me, but I did grow up in West Philadelphia, and I did for a time go to school in the suburbs on the main line. And so that kind of like the gulf between those two places is a really big part of the novel. But in general, like in this book, in the book I'm writing right now, in the short story collection I wrote, I tend to think about Philadelphia through sort of, I'm a really big fan of Edward P. Jones, the writer, short story writer and novelist from Washington, D.C. And I really became a kind of student of his in the way he would kind of mythologize just these sort of like mundane seeming places and sort of institutions in DC just by sort of putting them on the page. And I got really interested in that idea. And so I really a lot of times try to use landmarks and things like that to really create a place to create the city on the page. And I think one of the things that's become clear to me in the past 10 years or so is that for a lot of people who write about cities, that kind of writing also becomes a time capsule because the cities have changed so much, right? So like when you read Edward P. Jones, for example, to think about what Washington, D.C. is like now versus, the Washington, D.C. as it's like really full of just like these Black working class people and this kind of like all those kind of networks. And so it's kind of interesting to me because, in Philadelphia, like I have a lot of landmarks in West Philadelphia and Disgruntled. Some of them are still there, some of them it's like, oh, was that ever like that? So I think that those are some ways of thinking about how I approach it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so true just from reading both of your novels that like there's just these like places that if you live in Philadelphia, you're just like, it's automatic. You're just picturing it, like when, you're writing about different places, like I can see myself driving down that street, now, and then, when, maybe in times I did before, or like Liz there, you were talking about the empty lot. And I know that it's across the street from the 1 pound cheesesteak place that stays open 24 hours, like it's just those things that's like, I know where that thing is because of the way that you guys brought it to life. And so I guess my question, and Asali, I'm going to throw it to you first, is, what are you hoping that readers from Philadelphia, right? So I know you're not like writing to a specific audience, but what are you hoping that readers from Philadelphia will see of themselves in the city and in the novel? And Liz, I'll send it to you after that, but Asali, so first to you.
I mean, so one thing is, I was thinking about this. People who are watching now weren't on a few minutes before we started, but you and I were talking about um, oh no, I guess they were. You've referenced to Bologna having a first and a second name. And the thing about that reference is you have to be a certain age to get that reference. And so I definitely like sort of bringing in things that so people can say, oh, yes, as teenagers, we wandered around the gallery or we walked up and down South Street waiting for boys to yell nice things at us. Like just these very specific kinds of experiences that I've had in the city that I feel like a lot of people had in the city that will be some kind of like emotional or humorous sort of like revisiting from that for them. So that's one of the things. But the other thing is similar to thinking about what Edward P. Jones does, which is he takes people that would not be thought of as complex and interesting enough to be characters in fiction and makes them sort of really focuses on them, like their lives are, complex and fascinating and, people. And so I think that's no matter where you are, right? And so I think that's a big part of it as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Liz, to you then, what do you think about, what are you hoping readers from Philadelphia are going to see of themselves in this novel?
Honestly, I hope that they don't immediately recognize that I wasn't born and raised here. That's objective number one. I've gotten a lot of readers responding to some small, like, I don't know, shout outs to Philadelphia, like the silhouette of the horse and carriage that appears on a lot of doors in Kensington. And I don't know, Rosenberger's iced tea and a lot of Philly sports references, which I can't take any credit for at all, that all come out of having a sports fanatic husband who grew up as a fan of every Philly team. Yeah, I don't know. I hope I do an adequate job of kind of, describe. I'm writing from the first person point of view of a character who grew up in Fishtown. And so I'd like to believe that it's plausible even for natives of Philadelphia.
Well, I spent a lot of time in Fishtown before the gentrification, and the grandmother G is definitely a character that is all over Fishtown. So you got that one. You got that one absolutely right. Both of you have written these novels that, they're so different, right? There's, different tones and different storylines. But they both really talk to the profound impact that the city and the different demographics that the city has on the main characters, as they grow up, right, or as they go through grow through the story. So Kenya in Disgruntled, she grows up in the city, then goes to the main line, comes back to West Philly for a brief time. Can you talk, Asali, a little bit about the roles that each of those places play on the development of Kenya, who she is and how it impacts her as she grows up and seeks to find, who she is or her sense of identity?
Well, it's interesting because I think I was thinking about this when Liz was speaking. We both went to Barnard, but we went at different times. And I think where you are at different times sort of becomes a part of your development in a way, right? So I think that at that moment, right? And so a big thing about Kenya is that she's in middle school in the suburbs, and middle school anywhere is like the nadir, the nadir of one's sort of coming of age. There's already all this built-in alienation, but then it's sort of all exacerbated by being in this place. And I think that, but then there's another place in the novel that I sometimes forget about, which is that her father goes out and sort of starts a spoiler alert for people who have read it, a kind of compound in a place called Freedom, PA, which is some kind of rural Pennsylvania. And it's just kind of like the places are, in a lot of ways, it seems like each place in the novel is a different part of Kenya that she's understanding and exploring, right? and really trying to figure out something about, so in West Philly, she's really trying to figure out her parents. The main line, she's trying to figure out something about what, like, what it means to try to fit in an ideal America, you know. In Freedom with her father, she's also trying to figure out something about, like, I don't know, somewhere between his vision and his narcissism, you know, and it sort of goes on from there in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to talk in a few minutes about like place and like what place does. And so I just find it fascinating that like in both of your novels, like place is a huge piece of like what makes each character who they are. And then the fact that Kenya is named after a place is like I just found that to be like really fantastic and just a really like nice tie in. Liz, in Long Bright River, there's also like a couple scenes that, you know, that just really come out, you know, in terms of like the character development. We see Casey as she's like viewing the city that she's, you know, she's close to, but she's not like part of. And you write this place in one of the flashback bits where she attends the Nutcracker with her school. The sisters had grown up, and this is a quote from the book. The sisters had grown up 3 miles from the center of Philadelphia, but we only went there once a year on New Year's Day to watch a dozen of our cousins and uncles' bosses and uncles' friends march in the Mummers Parade. But now Casey is with her 60 to 80 kids bussed from, you know, her school to see the Nutcracker at the academy, and she puts on her fanciest outfits. And she says, but I think as a child, I wanted to signal to the other ballet goers in the lobby that I understood, that I had dressed up for the occasion, that I belonged there, that I was one of them, right? Can you talk a little bit just about that scene? That scene was just so, really impactful. And just how do you think that impacted Mickey and her decisions as an adult?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of, so Mickey was gifted as a kid, and she was told that she was gifted by various teachers who took an interest in her. And yet, due to the circumstances of her childhood, which include losing both of her parents to addiction and being raised by a grandmother who was simultaneously really in a tough position because she was very overworked and working multiple low-income jobs, and also very much still in mourning for the loss of her own daughter. She wasn't really able to give her granddaughters, whom she was raising, the type of warmth and affection that really makes children thrive. So, and also she was not at all supportive of Mickey's desire to get a good education. So when it comes time for Mickey to apply to college, her grandmother's extremely discouraging about going into any kind of debt for college. She's not, you know, fluent in the language of higher education, so doesn't know anything about how to apply for scholarships or, you know, so Mickey is dissuaded from even applying to college, and which is one of the reasons she ends up doing community college briefly and then going into the PPD. But the scene with the Nutcracker, I think, is so the autobiographical spark of that scene comes from two places. One is that my own child, my older daughter, is deeply obsessed with the Nutcracker in this moment, to the point that she dressed up as Clara, the young girl, sort of the star of the Nutcracker, for 2 Halloweens in a row. And listens to the Nutcracker soundtrack over and over and over again. So it was very much like in the background as I was writing Long Bright River. And the second is that the town I grew up in Massachusetts is a large working class town with a large underfunded public school system through which I passed from K to 12. And I have a distinct memory of going to an afternoon program specifically for public school children at the Boston Symphony Orchestra, where my entire group behaved so poorly for the duration of that performance that, like, I don't remember what our punishment was, and we weren't asked to leave. In the book, the kids are asked to leave. But I remember thinking, even at the time, this is an unfair request to make of a group of like 12-year-old children who've never been asked to sit through a symphony before in their lives, to put them in a position where, you know, the requirement is silence for an hour to 2 hours is not, you know, it doesn't make sense to do, even though the intention is good. So I think that's probably, I was drawing on that memory as much as anything in writing that scene.
Yeah, it came through, absolutely. Asali, there's a passage in Disgruntled when Kenya first attends the Barrett School for Girls, and you write about those, her classmates' perception of West Philly. And you say that the fifth graders who attended the Barrett School for the Girls heard a lot of crazy things about the city. They heard that kids their age carried knives to school and that everyone was on welfare. And then a little later, she has a birthday party and she notes that if she lived in West Philly, no one from Barrett would come to her party. So she ultimately feels comfortable, with her friends from the city, a little bit more so than those kids from Barrett. And I just wondered what was about that? Why do you think that's true for Kenya?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and that was, again, some of the less, sort of dramatic events that were like based on my real life experience. I went to prep school in the suburbs, and people would literally say things like, I heard there's pools of blood on the sidewalk in Philadelphia. And, it definitely, like, where I live would have been considered by a lot of people a bad neighborhood if the whole city wasn't considered a bad neighborhood. Except weirdly, there was like this one restaurant they all like to go to called City Lights. It was a very, I recall, undistinguished restaurant down on South Street that they all like to go to. But other than that, it was like the whole city was just like a terror dome. And I did actually once have a sleepover party, and the only people who came were the people from the city. And this one girl who was in my class, whose mom was sort of distinct from other people in the class because she was a divorcee. And so she was already walking on the wild side. And she, her daughter was like one of the few, people from the suburbs, and frankly, like white kids who seem to be allowed to come to my house. So, I mean, that's sort of basically what that's based on.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to just take a second to remind the folks who are watching that they can stick questions in the live chat, and we'll get those filtered in as we go through. I want to talk. I teased it a little bit earlier that I really feel like in addition to all the other themes of both your books, there's just these undercurrents of like insiders and outsiders, people that belong, people that don't belong, right? And I think like Philadelphia, Philadelphia is the perfect place for that, with our like history of like separation of neighborhoods and the suburban areas as well. Liz, in Long Bright River, that sense of place is similarly tied to like identity, right? So Mickey's beat places her both inside, but then not of Kensington, right? She's there, but she's not. But Casey landed in Kensington. She's like a prisoner, voluntary prisoner, but she's like stuck there. How do you use place? How do you use place as a way to help the reader? And do you think it was easier for those of us who like know the city to have that deeper understanding, or do you think that's like something that's more universal?
It's really interesting. Today, Thursdays are my long teaching day, so I spent a lot of time thinking about craft earlier today. And again, one of the things that we were discussing is the sense of when to use exposition in fiction and when to effectively like tell instead of show. And I think student writers often are very afraid of telling anything because they've been told for so many years of their education, show, don't tell, show, don't tell, show, don't tell. But there comes a point in a novel, there come many points in novels where if you're not doing some telling, you're going to lose the reader. And so in Long Bright River, I made the somewhat risky decision pretty early on to write like 3 full text pages about the layout of Kensington and the history of Kensington. Or maybe it's 2 full text pages. But I remember my editor like being like, you need to shrink this quite a bit. But to me, my assumption is that the majority of readers who are reading Long Bright River will not even be from Philadelphia, let alone Kensington. And so without a kind of visual map of what the neighborhood looks like and its layout, I feared that I might lose them. And so, yeah, I made that decision so that outsiders could sort of come into Kensington along with me, right? I am, as I have said, not native to Kensington. And so it was somewhat easy for me to sort of approach it as an outsider would and describe everything I noticed first about the neighborhood through that lens.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Sally, similarly, I found like the way that you used place signifies belonging. And, you know, especially with Kenya's dad, John Brown, he's from Bryn Mawr. Celia comes from the Richard Allen projects, right? So in what ways for your characters does place help define identity? And do you use place as a way to help the reader kind of know a little bit more about, like reveal a little bit more about those characters?
So in a sense, but at the same time, I think like Liz says, it's about you're also writing to people who have no idea. So in a way, like you're recreating the place as you write it, right? Like these are the associations you want to have with this, and these are the associations you have with this, and possibly they're very idiosyncratic, but certainly in the case of the novel, you know, Sheila comes from the Richard Allen projects, which once upon a time was like a sort of like really good place for people to live and raise families, and sort of creeping from the 70s into the 1980s really became a really hard place to be. And she sort of comes through with a desire to sort of distinguish herself in class terms, you know, and it's kind of the opposite of John Brown, who grows up on the main line, but grows up resenting any sense of a sort of like Black middle class and the conventions of you know the kind of self-sacrifice and discipline it takes to become a part of that class that he saw modeled by his parents. And so certainly for both of them, place is a lot of who they are and a lot of what they're reacting to.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have so many more questions. Questions are starting to come in from folks who are watching at home. So I'm gonna, someone asked about this, and I'll throw it, Asali, you were just on, so I'll throw it to you first, and then we'll go to Liz. Someone asked, are there any big Philly events or big Philly locations that you are planning on including in your next projects?
You know, so I wrote, the short story collection is largely about West Philadelphia. Disgruntled is largely about West Philadelphia. The other stories I've tended to publish in different places were also about West Philadelphia. So things are going to get crazy in the next one. That is set in Mount Airy. Now, I may have to get a sensitivity read or something like that. I don't know. Do a little more research. But that novel, so it's two places, set in Mount Airy, set on Bryn Mawr's campus. And I really don't have any. It's kind of funny. Like, what do I have, like really big events or that kinds of things? I actually don't. But that is something to think about. And I think, you know, if I read anything that takes place sort of in this era, I'll make sure to include the Black Star Film Festival, which is the most glamorous event in the city every year.
That's awesome. When you do research on Mount Airy, you can use our house. So we live in Germantown, so you can use this as like a landing place. You know, I know West Philly's so far, it's just far to get to. Liz, what are some things, any big Philly events or locations that you're planning on including in your next novel, or is this going to be another city?
First, I want to say that part of Long Bright River, a very short part of Long Bright River, is set in Mount Airy. And I hate to say this, I hate to admit it. Also, I see this is recording, but I literally was like, I had run out of research energy, and I was like, let me be lazy. I literally described Mount Airy. I was like, he works at the co-op. He's a hippie. He drinks tea. He gardens. That was like my Mount Airy shorthand. Like,
you're not wrong. You're not wrong.
Right? Yes. Sorry to Mount Airy. I have not spent as much time in Mount Airy as I have in Kensington or many other neighborhoods of this fine city. Anyway, my next novel is not actually set in Philadelphia. I will probably write another Philly novel at some point, but I felt like I needed a complete change of scenery to kind of break away from. It's very hard. I don't know if you find this, Asali. I was so used to writing in the voice of this character in Long Bright River that I really felt like I needed a complete change of scenery to make it feel sufficiently differentiated from Long Bright River. And so that's the approach I took.
That's great. Another question came through that just asked, what are some books that you all have been reading that really moved you or maybe swayed how you write. And Asali, I'm going to double down on that question because we had a panel on Tuesday on why Black books matter, and the panel talked a lot about books that they wished were written when they were younger, or books that they read when they were younger that spoke to them in a way that they just didn't see a lot of. There wasn't a lot of books by Black authors featuring Black characters. So maybe you could talk to maybe both of those things.
Well, I mean, so there's a couple different questions. So one is like books that I've been reading, and that would be like books that I've been reading recently, but kind of always have the same answer to the question of like books that inspire me. My favorite book is Maud Martha by Gwendolyn Brooks. This is like well documented on the internet. And I think, everybody should read that. And I think that, beyond that, there's so many different things where I've found inspiration. The book that I'm writing now is really engaged with Sula by Toni Morrison, Zami, which is Audre Lorde's biomythography, and not a book by a Black person, Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I think that in my fiction class, or in my classes, I've been assigning a lot of different things that I've found interesting. One is I'm teaching a Black horror class, and one of the books we read there is The Ballad of Black Time by Victor LaValle. It's a novella, so it maybe hasn't gotten as much attention as some of his other books, but that's a really great book. There's a contemporary short story collection that I think about a lot called Friday Black by Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah. And that's one of those, so it has a lot of sort of like dystopian, sort of supernatural, but at the same time, sort of realistic fiction in it. That's like a really strong social critique that I really like. But yeah, I don't know. Those are some things, some titles.
Thank you so much, Liz. How about you?
The question was just about inspiration as a whole, or inspiration as it relates to
books that you're intersecting with. Treehouse Books is a literacy center, and so what books are you engaging with as well?
So most recently, I've been really into like environmental horror fiction, which is not exactly an escape from anything, but yeah, I really like the work of Samantha Schweblin, who wrote in English, it's called Fever Dream. And I really like this author, Yoko Ogawa, who's a Japanese author who wrote a series of novella, a book called The Diving Pool, which is 3 novellas, which isn't precisely environmental horror, but carries some undertones of it. There's the writer Alexandra Kleeman has a forthcoming novel that's all about sort of the desert. It's set slightly in the future, in a moment when sort of like the water has run out in California. I don't know why I'm reading these books right now. I feel like that's just reality, but I don't know. Maybe it's like looking my greatest fears in the face helps me to understand them better or something. So that's me in this bleak moment. That's what I'm doing.
Some type of catharsis in some way, through literacy. Yeah. We have gone, this has been a fantastic conversation. I do have one, I want to end with one question for each of you. And it was inspired by a quote that I read that Asali, you gave, and I don't remember where it was, so I apologize to whoever I'm not crediting with this, but you said, someone had asked you about how autobiographical the novel was, and you said that Kenya goes through a much more difficult set of circumstances. And then you said, and I'm going to paraphrase what you said in the thing, you said, if my life was that interesting, I would have just written a memoir. And I just loved that line. So my question, is going to be kind of to both of you. What allows you both to have the space to be able to tell these stories that have reflections of your personal journey? And Asali, I'll go to you first, and then Liz will end with you.
Yeah, I mean, so I think, and I have said that because I think that that's true. I think that life itself, this kind of the same things happen to almost everybody, and there's no plot. And there's no arc. I mean, maybe you're on your deathbed and you're like, now I can see the structure of it all, but in order to give, life kind of drama and arc and plot, that's sort of, we turn to fiction. And we also turn to fiction to try to, I think in a lot of ways, even if our work is not heavily autobiographical, we're figuring things out about things that happen to us. We're trying to document sadness, we're trying to document joy, and also trying to figure out a way, so thinking about Liz's reading of environmental horror, like, I suspect, Liz, that you're getting tips, trying to figure out like what survival might look like, in the coming time. So I think that that's what fiction is, this sort of like imaginative exercise in, working through past mistakes, working ahead of future mistakes, and also just documenting the sort of like, whatever life is about.
Yeah, I felt the same way when I was reading Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler early on in the pandemic. I was like, this is a handbook is what this is. Liz, what for you, what allows you to have the space and the insight that helps you tell these stories?
The most straightforward answer to that question is childcare. Like, childcare allows me to have the space to tell these stories. Yeah, I know anyone with children in this pandemic who's also trying to write probably feels the same way. But in terms of imagination, I think I agree with a lot of what Asali says. For me, when I write fiction, it's a kind of like time travel for me. It actually allows me to worm my way back into things I had almost forgotten about. Like the minute I start writing about a childhood memory in fictional form, or if I'm drawing inspiration from something that happened in my childhood, I find myself sort of like processing other things that happened around that time that I hadn't even remembered until I started writing. So there's sort of a nostalgia, there's a nostalgic component to writing fiction for me, where it lets me travel back in time to either warm moments or difficult moments and think about them in new ways. And yeah, it's sort of a way to, I don't know, I have this, like, when I'm really hitting my stride with writing, I have a really wonderful sense of, oh, like maybe I can bring some kind of entertainment to somebody else, like some kind of brief distraction, happiness, entertainment, joy, whatever.
Did Liz go a little quiet there?
And it will give them a little bit of respite for whatever reason.
Thank you so much, Liz. That's great. Absolutely fantastic. This has just been an absolute treat for me, both of you. I just am so thankful, to you all. Just so thankful for you spending some time with us, today and sharing a little bit about your novels with our, the folks who support Treehouse Books. We're gonna shift in the next, 5 minutes or so. We're gonna do a little self-indulgent celebration. So we hope both of you can stay on and experience this, but we're gonna say goodbye and thank you so much to both of you. This has just been such an engaging conversation. So thank you, and thanks for logging in, and to everyone else, make sure you go get 2 books wherever books are sold.
Thanks for the questions, and thanks for listening to everyone who came.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. I'm going to trust that everyone here who's watching, if you haven't already done so, you're going to go out, you're going to add Disgruntled, Long Bright River to your home libraries. We're going to have a couple of signed copies. I hope that we're going to be able to raffle off. And everyone who bought a ticket tonight is going to be entered into that raffle. So check your email tomorrow or Saturday and see if you are the winner. This has just been, the past 3 days have just been a fantastic way for us to celebrate 15 years of Treehouse Books. In a moment, we're going to share just a special, short 3-minute clip It has images and different things that we've collected over the years. Before then, I just want to say thank you to our authors, Liz and Asali, for giving their time tonight. Also our other authors for yesterday's Kids Storytime, Auntie Jojo the Storyteller, Pat McLean Smith, and Tanisha Chambers. We also want to recognize the amazing panelists that were around for Tuesday's Why Black Books Matter talk, which was Dr. Wanda Brooks, author M.K. Asante, Harriet's Bookshop owner Janine Cook, and our own program director, Sabria Shipley. I also want to personally thank the Champions of Literacy Board Committee, especially Nicole, who's been doing the lion's share of the tech work tonight, and Melissa, who just did everything in her power to pull this tonight together. So thankful to all of you. We're about to queue up that video. So Nicole, whenever you're ready, go ahead and play that and stay online. While it's playing, you can get your drinks ready for the toast.
One of my favorite stories that John Weiss, who is one of the founders of Treehouse Books, tells me is that when they opened up the abandoned storefronts in order to create and start building what now is Treehouse Books, that the building was so dilapidated that there was a hole in the ceiling. And out of that hole, growing about 2 stories high in the middle of the treehouse space, was a tree. And John had a vision. He had a vision of kids playing on and in that tree. So of course he had to repair the hole and actually cut down the tree. But John and the folks who were developing and building Treehouse Books, they put a loft and they decorated the entire thing like a tree, a place for kids to play, a place for kids to read, a place for kids to grow and learn together. And that's actually where Treehouse Books got its name. In the best of times, Treehouse Books exists as a part of the North Philadelphia community, responding to the neighborhood and giving the neighborhood what it needs. Treehouse Books is a part of the fabric of this North Philadelphia community. We know that this community is under-resourced, but it does not lack spirit, it does not lack imagination, and it does not lack people who are willing to put in the time and work to make it one of the best communities in the city.
This year, we're celebrating our 15th year anniversary, which is just so incredible. I've been a part of Treehouse myself for roughly 8 years, first as a volunteer many years ago, and then kismetly a board member for the last 2.5 years. In all that time that I've worked with Treehouse, I have been fortunate to see so many incredible people positively impacted by the work that we do. Now, of course, that's been some incredible young people and kids that we've served over the last 15 years, but that's so many other people as well, whether it be volunteers, our staff, our advisory board and board members, partners, and community members alike. I could argue that almost every person that interacts with Treehouse is better because of it.
Treehouse Books is a pillar in the North Philadelphia community. We're doing a fantastic job sustaining the community of readers, writers, and thinkers in the North Philadelphia area. For the last 15 years celebration, we have made sure that families and friends of this community have had access to books. And I'm just a proud member of this organization, and I know that this organization will last a lifetime.
All of the programs that Treehouse Books creates and designs are built out of a need that the community has and a way that we can come alongside of the community and help be a part of our shared future.
Treehouse really quickly became my home away from home. I was in a city that I didn't know very well. My family was hundreds of miles away, and Treehouse became what it is to so many other people, a safe space to continue to learn and grow even as an adult. Of course, once I met the Treehouse kids as well, the rest was pretty much history. These kids are so creative, positive, and inspiring, and they make it so easy for us to continue working hard to create more opportunities for them. So we're here on our 15th anniversary, still making space to create a community of readers, writers, and thinkers, and we could not do it without you and your support, so thank you so much.
Come to Treehouse Books. We have books for days, we have snacks for days, and we have fun.
Thanks to Dante Knox for that video. We're gonna throw that up on YouTube. So if it skipped in any places or you didn't see it, feel free to jump on YouTube and you'll get to see that full thing and all the different pictures from the past 15 years. All right, so it's come time. We're now going to raise our glasses together, whatever you have in the glass. And we're gonna do this toast. We're gonna toast to the spirit of all those who birthed Treehouse Books, to those who picked up the mantle along the way, and to those families and kids who came through over the years, and to the families and kids who will for the next 15 years and beyond. Salute. Our 2020 Champions of Literacy event and our 15-year celebration would not be possible without all our amazing sponsors, especially our diamond sponsors, Quirk Books, Running Press, Dana and Melissa Ash. Tonight, as you log off, I just ask that you consider a donation to help Treehouse Books continue our mission and last throughout the pandemic and into the next generation. You're gonna find that link in the chat or on our website. We thank you so much for joining us and we hope you have a wonderful evening.